but maybe you got to start with your people, your own heart. Who is my one, and how am I aligning to the idea of making more and better disciples? It will be really hard to lead a church that's focused on more and better disciples if I wasn't leading my life with a focus on one to be reached and being a better disciple.
Well, hey everyone, welcome to the Intentional Churches podcast. This podcast exists to give you practical wisdom and insight into leading your church and aligning to the Great Commission. In this season, we've been taking a deep dive into this idea of radical alignment in our churches to the Great Commission. So if you're listening to these episodes and you're wondering how your church can get started on this journey, or maybe even just take some next steps in the journey of alignment, we actually have a free ebook for you. It's only about a 15-minute read, and it will help get you and your church pointed in the right direction when it comes to radical alignment. So you can download the ebook for free by visiting intentionalchurches.com/podcast. We got a great episode in store today, and as usual, I'm joined by my good friend Doug Parks. What's up, Doug?
How's it going, Erin? Can't wait. It's going to be fun.
Because we are also joined by Doug's friend, his partner in crime, our good friend Bart from Intentional Churches. What's up, Bart?
Hey, yo.
Bart, what is your official title at Intentional Churches? How do you guys? What are your titles? How do you divvy this up?
We wrestle with that titling thing. I'm chief strategy or content officer. So a lot of developmental projects I work on, but I also get on planes and help churches like Doug does directly, running intentional growth planning and stuff like that. Yep.
Okay. Well, I think we're in for a treat on this episode because these guys are, yes, they are partners in crime. That I see is kind of their thing together, and I'll just invite you in that even before the episode, there was just chaos between the two of them in the best way possible.
Can I say something? My kids last night told me that Doug and I are looking more and more alike over time. I thought that was pretty scary.
That is funny. That's good.
That was weird is what it was.
Yeah. Well, we, Bart, have been on a journey in this season of talking about radical alignment. And so we thought we'd dive in actually to this idea of intentional churches. So Bart, would you just help us into this? Tell us why the organization is called Intentional Churches. Because by logic, it means you think that there are unintentional churches. So right. Why the name intentional? Yeah. Maybe tell us some characteristics of churches that are unintentional. Help us into that.
Yeah. So on the intentional churches side, this is a long time back when Doug and I started this. We just needed a name for what we were doing. So that's kind of where it began. And so we just thought, what's the best way to frame? And we're super creative. So the idea intentional churches came about, and we put it on some information and started to ask our friends if they'd be interested in working with us in their churches. But really the idea of intentional churches, if I had to frame it from my perspective, it's about stewardship. So if you're going to we get the privilege of working in the most powerful institution on the planet. The most miraculous, life-changing, and it was given to us in this strange partnership with the Lord Almighty, and we were asked to be stewards of it. So to whom much is given, if you think about the power of the gospel, the Holy Spirit, and prayer to change lives and impact communities, really intentional just equals how do we be the best stewards with regard to the mission and the gifts that God has given us in this incredible institution. So that's really kind of my summary.
Okay, that's great. What are some characteristics of an unintentional church? Like for our listeners, how would they know if they are in what you guys would view as an unintentional church?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll have you guys help me chime in on some examples. I'll give you some categories, but you could write a book on Unintentional Churches. In fact, I had a friend say, you guys should start another podcast called Unintentional Churches. I thought that was funny. I'm not sure.
We'll do a season. We're going to do a
the
season on unintentional churches. Would you like to be
There we go.
listeners? Would you like to be a guest on this season's episodes of Unintentional Churches?
Exactly. That's what I told the guy. I'm like, you'll never get any guests on there. That's terrible.
Oh, it's so funny.
It could always be just fake guests, I guess. Anyway, no, I'm just kidding. So unintentional churches, generally wobbly, organizationally not well-directed. There's a leadership void. And in general, the mission, which is the Great Commission, given to us in Matthew 28, is not the mission really. And so they've replaced the mission with a new mission. That's one characteristic. And so I was thinking about ways that I'm going to get us in trouble, I think, maybe. But the ways they replace the mission with a different mission can be really subtle. Like, for instance, serving the poor becomes the mission. Really, that's not the mission. The mission was to make more and better disciples. The mandate given to us in teaching them to obey, which is part of the Great Commission, was definitely not to neglect the poor, for instance. The mission can be community impact, and that's not really the mission. The mission was go make more and better disciples. The mission can be, this is a touchy one, but like worldwide missions. And so we're not reaching anyone, making more and better disciples in our Jerusalem or Antioch, but yet we sort of idolized the mission of world missions, and eventually we'll not have permission or ability to do any of that if we make that the mission. It really was to be making more and better disciples in our Jerusalem or Antioch. So I don't know if you guys have another way the mission gets replaced, but that's one thought that came to my mind. Clearly, they're not convicted about that. That is the mission.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to add, because it's kind of my soapbox, especially this season, is in that what Bart's talking about, and we need a way to measure this. We really do. And I think you'll see this potentially coming from us in the coming months or years, is the slide in America, at least, to very subconscious, at times, institutional mindsets and the professional modernized version of clergy, where if it's a smaller church where the pastor is expected to do all the work of ministry and the people know the church by the church building or whatever. But in a mega church, it's more about the digital footprint, which is a very institutional thing, or the branding, or, something we have talked about probably ad nauseum through our journey, Bart, the silver bullet mentality, where we just are convinced there's some great institutional strategy out there that we don't know yet that's going to deliver the return we want. Whereas what Bart's saying, when we talk about intentional churches, it is personal ownership of the Great Commission from every person in your leadership all the way down through the congregation, where they're active in Great Commission activity and work. And when we do that, then by nature, the organization will grow, and we will always be fighting this idea of misalignment. As more and more people come on board, we've got to continually remind them this is a personal expression. Bart, Erin mentioned in the setup just talking about the ebook, and I thought maybe just on the unintentional side, maybe list out a couple of the things in there for our listeners about, like, hey, here might be some symptoms or signs of, if you're getting misaligned or maybe going down this road of being an unintentional church.
Yeah, well, I kind of alluded to them. I can give a little better description. Like, the wobbly church kind of has a leadership tug of war that goes on, and they may move a little bit forward, but they're kind of pulled left and right by kind of undefined leadership roles sometimes, or just powerful leadership agendas. There can be a church that kind of wanders, so it can go any direction it wants with no leadership as well. Again, the wobbly church can make its way forward, but eventually it'll get stuck in that tug of war. The wandering church can kind of go in any direction it wants because it's not clear what its mission is. And so Doug's alluding to silver bullets. They'll just take trips and go see if they can't find the latest thing to plug in. If it sounds good, we'll give it a go. And eventually that'll usually that will get you stuck as well. And then we have churches that are just in retreat, thinking that their best days are behind them. And I just don't. I'm doing a workshop in Kentucky in about a month. No, in a couple weeks. And we titled it basically The Church on Mission, Your Best Days Are Ahead. I believe I can make that promise to every church, but some have just kind of given up in the face of maybe cultural challenges, maybe financial challenges, maybe that they're in a small community and they think the idea should only be, the mega churches are the only ones winning and not smaller ministries. And so I don't believe that at all. So those are the kind of unintentional, what maybe hopefully something in there at least can describe what an unintentional church looks like.
Well, and I'm going to add one more right now in the season we're in, and that is the really rapidly growing church, which we're seeing all over the country. Lots of new conversions. I've referenced it before. We're on the edge of, it feels like, revival in America in some ways, especially the younger generation. But that church is becoming an unintentional church. You don't even know it. It feels good because all the metrics are up and to the right. But when you're in that fast-growing environment, misalignment is seeping in at every corner as everybody has a different idea of what church should be. And usually it is not based in training, equipping, and sending of the 99 to go reach their ones. And when you're fast growing, that is actually happening to you probably at a quicker pace than that misalignment than it is in some of these other examples Bart's giving.
Yeah, so I'll give you one more thought. Doug stole one of mine, which was the replacement of the biblical model with an institutional perspective. I think that's just critical to think about and unpack, where staff become program directors.
Mm-hmm.
I was in a church where a senior leader shot down a youth leader for going to the high school to be with the kids because he didn't know when he was going to have time to get his job done. So just let that soak in for a minute. Like, when are you spending all this time with people? When are you going to actually do your job? That's a programmatic institutional perspective. And then I think there's one more thing that we got to watch out for, and that is the part of intentionality is bringing an organizational OS into the mix. So a way of operating that, like Doug said, aligns the hearts and minds and equipping of everybody. So what happens is, I've been thinking about this a lot. Just good church leaders, it seems like this would be natural. We look from the outside in, we should be, to what the model should be and our way to evaluate how we're doing at the mission. Again, very much a perspective that God gave us the mission, He gave us the capabilities, and He gave us very clear instructions, I believe, out of Acts in how to do church. So a lot of unintentional churches will look from within for the OS. So they become self-guided and governing. And so default OSs take over. And we've talked about some of these, maybe you can chime in, but like the consensus, keep everybody happy OS takes over. The power, this is a big one. Like, just the most powerful person gets to make the directional calls in our churches. And that power can come from all kinds of places: money, prestige, position, longevity. But there, you know what I'm saying? And then we also replace our evaluations of how we're doing from internal personal preference and comparison to others, or maybe others within the group. And we sort of limit our sights even on evaluating progress by creating in default OS or an internal evaluation, instead of looking at it from a biblical perspective with the Lord Almighty as the judge, because He's given us the mandate and instruction. So I don't know, Doug, I know you probably have something to say on that one, man. As much as we've talked about it.
You said it well.
So you guys have named a lot of symptoms, which I think are helpful. And my guess is many of our listeners are going, yeah, I have experienced that or am experiencing one of those things. But I'm curious, like, how does a church take steps towards being an intentional church? The reality is no church is 100% intentional in every way, shape, and form. Like, we all have steps we could take. We all have progress. I'm sure progress to be made. I'm sure there's parts of all of our churches that are a hint unintentional, if we're being honest. But how does a church take steps towards being an intentional church? And how would you characterize, like, what is IC's unique contribution to church leaders that are on the journey of becoming more intentional?
Yeah, I think, let me answer the first part, Bart, and you take the second part about IC. Well, this seems like a no-brainer, like a duh. But what we discovered by going literally team by team across lots of different denominations and networks of churches was that a lot of the leadership of the local church wasn't personally owning the Great Commission themselves. So the starting point has to be, you have to own it yourself. And now we have teams that have evolved over time that are like, literally, it's written into job descriptions. Like, you're supposed to carve out time in your week. It's okay to go have a meal with your ones. But often, and so that happens in staff leadership we see, and then boards or board of directors, not everyone, not every board is like this, but we see a lot of board of directors who see their role more as the stewards of the organization and less of the owners of Great Commission activity in their relational networks. And so step one to becoming an intentional church is just kind of doing a really, what we call last 10% of truth conversation with your core leaders to say, am I doing this? And if I am, there should be evidence of stories. These should be literally on team agendas where we're asking, hey, tell us about a one. How can we pray for your ones? What's going on in your activity during your week where, you know, you're praying through investing in relationally to ones and to each other? That is the really root of an intentional church. It has to begin at the individualized level. And then the way I frame it a lot these days is, if you do that, the gospel is an acquisition proposition. Your church will grow. And if and when it grows, then we have to fight the institutional footprint as we get more money and resources and assets, buildings, where we'll be tempted to go chase organizational strategies. So it really is important, this organizational leadership, that we minimize the footprint of the institution. And I'm using this, I know we need to be a hospital for hurting and we need to provide care for people. But the primary job of a local church should be training and sending, not gathering and filling. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, Bart, how about you?
Well, I want to piggyback on something I said earlier about world missions. We're big. What Doug just said, a church that lives like that training and sending church has a powerful world missions perspective. So just, I don't want anybody to misunderstand that we believe staying focused in our Jerusalem and Antioch ends up in an Acts 1:8 paradigm that the Lord kind of gave us model, but then also that furthermore, that goes back to you and your life as the beginning point, and you aligning your life to the Great Commission. I thought about this today, Doug, to piggyback on what you say, and I'll talk about IC, was if every leader aligned themselves to the Great Commission in the same way, our leadership toolbox would almost be unnecessary in a way, because every leader would walk into the leadership room making decisions through a Great Commission, more and better disciple lens. They would just be doing it. And so here's how we do it. We teach a toolbox for leadership teams, including elder boards, and a congregational toolbox we're building, which I'll tell you more about in a minute, to live a one-aware and activated life that aligns with the leadership toolbox. The way we get it going is often with this tool, which is a basic biblical model we call the Great Commission Engine. Somebody can download it from intentionalchurches.com, study a little more about it, but you have to have a model with language that everybody agrees to. So that's kind of why we've done that. It kind of creates a really simple starting point with a focus on the lost in the middle of it. And then that begins to shape the thinking and the heart and equips both leadership to make leadership decisions and people to live one-aware and activated lives. The strength to do that, the ability, is in our toolbox. So it guides you in how to make those decisions. And then eventually the next step would be you have to roll it, like Doug was saying, you have to evaluate very honestly which part, and this would be of my own life, or which part of my leadership in my church is most misaligned, and beginning to work. There's two ways at it. You can build on the strong part and work to the weaker, or you can go work on the weaker part and then try to amplify the strong parts of where you're aligned organizationally, should say misaligned organizationally or personally to the Great Commission. So we have to get step 3 is you got to get every constituent, if you would, every person, every congregant, every leader, and eventually the toolbox into the leadership room for decision making. That's step 3. And then step 4 is now you need a group to run with. And so we're building these things called learning communities. I think you guys have been talking about them. We need to definitely talk about them more, because we want IC and churches that want to align with the Great Commission to be a broad learning community. And we're actually putting a platform and technology together. And so both the One Life toolbox for your life to be aligned with the Great Commission and the digital platform are going to be rolled out at the conference in April. So again, I know we've been telling people about the conference, but I just can't tell you how important it would be to get there, to join the conversation and be a part of the community. All kinds of ways to engage it. But again, you need a model. You have to shape your thinking in your heart. You have to roll it out with leadership and the congregation. And then you need a community to run with, because the devil doesn't want any of this to happen. And so we must stay encouraged and equipping one another. So that's kind of how we do it at IC.
Doug, would you speak for just a minute on the idea of intentional churches as a learning community? Like, would you just say a word about that?
Yeah, well, I was recently talking to one of the core churches leaders that's apart, where we've really made church leaders and churches the center of IC, and not so much experts and thought leaders and all that kind of stuff. And he said about the conference, and we're getting ready to shape the 2025 conference, you guys created the unconference. And what he meant by that was, one of the things, if you're new to IC and you're listening, the invitation is here to be a contributor, not just a consumer of resources that IC has. And that Bart and I and our leadership team believe that we are all better together. This is a new and different way than maybe we've ever really done in my lifetime in America, that we all will sit inside of a learning community where we will all contribute in some way. Yes, we will learn from others. And then Bart said, the support in ministry of having, peer support is really important. But I just think this idea that we all need to go to the latest church leader conference or read the latest book, and that somehow that content is going to transform my my learning and my church leadership. I don't think that's true. And I ran that race for a long time, to a lot of conferences and reading a lot of books. The learning community side of IC, which is really becoming the powerhouse of the movement, again, just calling church leaders and congregants back to this basics of the Great Commission. That's where I think if you're newer to IC, you will find a home. And if you're already in this learning community, thank you. We are so grateful. And the things, even some of these episodes that we've done this season, where we're interviewing practitioners at the ground who are getting their teams aligned, it just proves the power of the learning community versus the older models that's more silver bullet thought leader driven.
Yeah, it's really good. So there's kind of two groups of people then in our listeners, I would imagine. There's those that are already kind of a part of this learning community, are taking steps in this direction, already partnering with IC in this way. And then there's the group of people that are not, and who are not taking, steps in this direction, at least under the umbrella of IC. And so I want to get just really practical for a minute here and talk about those two groups of people. And so maybe Bart, you can help us into this, but
Sure.
For those that are like new to this idea of this learning community, to this idea of what IC is doing and becoming and helping churches become intentional churches, what are practical things that those listeners could do this week or this month with their teams to move forward on the journey of becoming a more intentional church?
Yeah, well, at, again, intentionalchurches.com, you can always download tools. You can go to our YouTube channel, and there are videos about the Great Commission engine there. But one thing I thought of was if I would be pretty convicted, and we've seen this a lot, if I was listening to this and wanted to start this journey. And the first thing you have to do is get 2 or 3 with you, and you got to start praying. It's a spiritual matter in our churches and church leadership. And I know that sounds simple, maybe too simple, but you got to make this a matter of prayer to basically break through the heart. The next thing you got to do is pick where to start. I was with a church, this is kind of blends both those ideas together, that was realizing that they weren't ready to implement our leadership team toolbox, that they needed to start with the hearts of the leaders in the congregation first. And that may be where you're at. And so they're coming to a training, first of its kind, One Life training, in November 13 and 14 at Greenwood Christian Church in Indiana. If you're in the Indianapolis area, I would encourage you maybe to get over there to explore, and we can give you more information about this. But maybe you got to start with your people, your own heart. Who is my one, and how am I aligning to the idea of making more and better disciples? It will be really hard to lead a church that's focused on more and better disciples if I wasn't leading my life with a focus on one to be reached and being a better disciple. Yeah. So you're going to see that at that training. That'd be another practical thing. And then just always remember, it starts with you and your own personal audit and evaluation and steps into this. So yeah, I hope that's great. Some good ideas for folks.
Yeah, that's great. How about to the other group of people that is already engaged, actively engaged in this learning community of intentional churches? Any thoughts, Doug, that you would want to pass to those people, just to practical steps that they could take just this week or this month? Or are they the same as what Bart has already kind of outlined for us?
Well, that's always the starting point, what Bart described. And but I would say to those who are already in the community to some degree or another, first off, thank you for saying yes and leaning in. I would say each of you kind of knows your own situation, and so getting your head around what is the right next step. One of the things that I'm very excited about is we're going to be rolling out the Intentional Churches journey, which is going to give better hooks for someone who's already implementing to hang their strategies on, about how they're bringing on board their new staff. Like I was recently in Florida, and for a new group of staff for a longtime core church of IC, 20 new staff members, I did a half a day experience where they onboarded to our leadership toolbox that Bart is talking about. And so if you're already on the journey, you just have to feel out what's the right next step in that journey. And we're going to have a lot more concreteness around it. One for a lot of the churches that I know listen to the podcast is going to be something around getting your board or your eldership, if you have elders, really thinking and aligning back to the Great Commission, which the ebook that you mentioned at the top of this episode, Erin, it's a great place to start for that, to get a conversation going in your eldership and your board. That's going to be a lot of our churches. And then lastly, if you're already engaged, maybe the next step is trying to get your departments down and in your org chart if you have a bigger staff, or if you're a smaller church and you have volunteer teams. How do you use some of our leadership toolkit to advance this thinking? Again, remembering fundamentally, it always has to start where Bart said, personal ownership by every individual in your staff, leadership to the Great Commission.
Can I mention one little tidbit? We do have a study guide that goes with our primary book called Intentional Churches for both leadership teams and elders. We're working more and more with elder teams, and a lot of them have studied and used that. So that's just another practical way we can get that guide to folks too, I believe.
That's awesome. Thank you guys. So grateful for all the just tools and resources and things. For our listeners, I hope that whether you have already been actively engaged in this journey or or not, that you take a step, that all of us are committed to keep taking steps towards becoming more intentional churches. None of us want to be featured on the season of Unintentional Churches. So we can keep working towards being intentional churches. Doug, Bart, thank you guys for the work that you do and just your care and concern for the local church. So grateful for you guys. I just want to say thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Intentional Churches podcast. And just remember, we've mentioned it a couple times, the free ebook for all of us to download about this idea of radical alignment. It's only going to take 15 minutes to read, and you can download it for free by visiting intentionalchurches.com/podcast. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Intentional Churches podcast.